So today we're going to talk about building an API monetization stack. Now, I'm not necessarily going to prescribe to you exactly how to do it, but what I'm actually hoping to do is give you some technical questions to run through as you actually start to monetize APIs. So who am I? My name is Matt Tanner. I work as the head of developer relations at a company called Moesif. What we do is we do API analytics, and we also, about 2 years ago, started to venture into infrastructure for API monetization. My job itself focuses mainly on API first strategy, monetization, and product-led growth. Now, the last two, monetization and product-led growth, really go hand in hand, especially when we're talking about self-service monetization. And my background is a mix of enterprise knowledge and a love for startups. So I've been working with startups now, various startups for the last almost 4 years. Prior to that, I worked for some of the largest banks and insurers in Canada. As you can tell probably from my accent. So really what I want to start off by saying is that implementing API monetization is hard. I've spent the last 2 years working with various companies through Moesif to help them implement API monetization. Almost every single one of them have come to us and said, this is actually a very difficult thing to do, and we need some help to do it. Most of them come to us and say, we're not even really sure where to start. So why is it so hard to implement? The reason why it's so hard to implement is because from what I've seen, working with about 30 plus companies on monetizing their APIs, is that every single implementation is 100% custom. There are certain things that overlap, and there's certain strategies, and there's certain concepts that kind of go hand in hand throughout it. However, it still is generally a lot of custom coding and a lot of custom implementation. Now, when we start to think about monetization, a lot of us as technical people think about, okay, give me the requirements, we'll implement it. But you have to look at two core factors when you're starting to monetize APIs. And these two core factors, first, start off with the business needs. And based on those business needs, that drives the technology to do it. Now, this is pretty standard in terms of implementing anything. However, what I would say is that the business needs very directly influence what technology you can use. Because with monetization, for instance, if you're picking a billing provider, so let's say Stripe or something like that, and your business needs are one thing and that billing provider doesn't support those, and you're locked into that stack, you then have to go and readdress the business needs. So it's not so much defining the business needs and then the technology, it's very much synergistic of making sure that you check that business needs, okay, can the technology do it? No, okay, let's reiterate back and adjust. So it's very much a give and take, which is different than what we usually find, where it's, okay, I know exactly what I need to implement. Let's now run and take that technology away and do it. So how do you determine the business needs or requirements? A lot of the time when we chat with the folks in the business, what they say is, you have APIs, let's monetize them. And that's about the conversation that you get. What you need to do is you need to ask these questions here, which are, what APIs are you monetizing? And each of these questions is going to then drive the technology that you can use. So you ask, what APIs do you want to monetize? And we'll go into kind of how to determine which ones you should monetize. Another key part here, I would say probably the most important, would be how do you plan to monetize them? If you plan to monetize them where it's just, okay, we're just going to charge them per API call, then the stack that you can use is quite a bit larger. If they start to do more niche stuff, let's say they're charging on a transaction percentage, if you have some type of payments API and you want to charge 3% per transaction, then you kind of have to dial in the technology just a little bit more. You also need to talk to them about the timeline for going live with the monetization capabilities. If they give you a 3-month timeline, you may have to buy a stack. So instead of creating custom stuff, you might want to buy something to get rolling a little quicker. Or let's say they give you 2 years to implement it, you might be able to do stuff that's a little bit more in the build sector. And lastly is, are there any strict technology requirements? So are there a specific billing provider that you have to use? Maybe you only have one that's been approved within your enterprise. Maybe you have some type of BI tool that they need that data to go to. And maybe one of the technologies that you plan to use doesn't support that. So you want to make sure that you ask them, maybe not necessarily like what programming language you want us to use in that, but you do want to ask them, are there any stacks, part of the stack that we should be locking in terms of delivering data here or there, or billing provider? Really, at the end of the day, it's about asking the right questions to determine the technical needs. Working a lot of times at Moesif, what we find is that folks that approach us are from the business. They come to us, they say, we need to monetize. How do we do this? But it's very, very hard to answer that question to business folks when they're not including engineering. So you really need to make sure that if you know that your company is going off and trying to monetize APIs and you're going to be implementing it, to try and be in those conversations. It's going to allow you to probably be more successful with it than if you come in later. So asking the right questions allow you to determine those technical needs. Now, you also want to ask a couple more questions, and these dive into the business just a little bit further. So how will the users access the APIs? Are we going to do something like self-service, where we have a developer portal, they can log in and provision their own API keys, manage their own billing without any outside input? Or are we going to do a more manual, sales-driven approach, where what we might do is a customer might come to you, say, hey, I want to pay you $10,000 for your API, and the customer success team or sales team handles the sign-up. Then you might manually provision API keys. You might adjust the billing plan manually. Either of these are viable, but they come with their own pros and cons. So if we do self-service, a big staple of that is it's going to enable product-led growth. It's kind of hard to do that with manual or sales-driven approaches because there's no self-serve in those motions. Another thing about self-service is developers like it. As a developer, what I really don't like is when I'm going to use a product and I have to go to the sales team to do it. We don't like talking to sales teams. That's just how we are as developers. And another thing with self-service is that it's scalable. You can have as many people, as long as your infrastructure supports it, you can have as many people come sign up as you want. You're not going to have to scale up your sales team in order to accommodate that because a lot of it is going to be automated. Cons are going to be the fact that it requires a credit card. If you have large API monetization that you plan to deploy, and these are tens of thousands of dollars per month, likely you're not going to be able to facilitate that self-service with a credit card because no manager is going to let their developer put $10K per month or more on a credit card. That usually just doesn't happen. Another thing with self-service is that it generally requires a developer or customer portal. You need somewhere where people can log into and then do all those things in terms of provisioning API keys and managing billing. It also takes some tech work to implement. Compared to the manual side where we don't really have to have much tech to do it. We can probably use an API gateway, provision keys, do all the quota management manually. We're going to need some automation in there. So that is going to take some work. From the manual side, kind of as I alluded to, there's less tech required. We could technically do that with an API and probably an API gateway. We could monetize that, provision an API key, and then put a quota on that key. Another pro to it is that when you're doing a sales-driven approach, you also get that direct customer contact and relationship building. So for larger enterprises, if you're planning on monetizing to larger enterprises, you really do need that relationship building. Cons of it, obviously, it's not very scalable. So you can go and do this at a smaller scale, but if you start to onboard thousands of developers a month and you're doing it manually, that's going to be very hard to do. And leads into the last factor there, where as it does scale, there's going to be that human factor, where it could technically lead to errors. The next question that you need to ask is, how are users actually going to be charged for this API usage? And a lot of the time, you'll find that the business isn't quite sure how they want to do this. What I find is that the second option generally doesn't get discussed because sometimes businesses don't know that they can do that. And sometimes developers don't know they can do that too. So with subscription-based, what you're essentially doing is, I'm going to pay a certain amount, and I'm going to then get a certain amount of API calls, keys, or sessions for that allotted subscription. With meter-based, what you end up doing is they're getting charged on the exact amount that they're using. So, meter-based is going to be a lot more flexible. It's going to be more efficient for customers, easier revenue expansion, and it can appear cheaper. And I'll go over those points. So what you end up seeing with the revenue expansion is as users use more, revenue goes up. That doesn't necessarily happen with subscription-based. If I've paid for 10,000 API calls, and my next tier is, let's say, 20,000 API calls, if they're paying up to 10,000 API calls, that's the money you're making. Whether they use 9,000, 10,000, if they go above that, you might charge an overage fee, which we'll chat about in a minute here. But it does give kind of this gap. What you get with meter-based is that if they're, let's say right now they're using 10,000 API calls. Next month they use 11. Next they use 12. Every single month our revenue is going up. It's pretty much kind of automatic. We're allowing them to expand as they need. That's a little bit tougher to do with subscription-based. Now, with subscription-based, as you can see here, there is some pros to it, which it enforces a minimum spend. So if our lowest tier is, let's say, $100, we know that anybody that comes and uses our service is spending at least $100. If I charge $1 per API call and someone only uses 3 calls, then I'm only making $3 if I'm doing a meter-based approach. But with subscription-based approach, I know that even if they use 3 API calls, I'm making $100. 50 calls, $100. I know if they're within that tier, I'm making that money. It's kind of predictable. It's more predictable for the customer too, because they know exactly what that tier is costing them. And it's easy to implement. You could do this at the API gateway level. When you actually provision the API key, just provision it with that quota in mind. As I kind of alluded to, it's harder to expand revenue though, because you then have to, if someone's using, let's say they got $1,000 in spend and that's what you're charging them, and your next tier is $2,000, you have to justify to them that they need to upgrade. Now, if you're paying for 10,000 calls and you need to use 10,001 calls, and you go from $1,000 to $2,000, that's a very expensive API call just for one single call to expand. So that means that pricing might not be aligned to the value that they're getting back. With meter-based, you get this con where it can really upset customers with billing surprises. And the thing that I kind of relate this to is if anyone has ever spun up an EC2 instance, left it on, and then come back at the end of the month and realized, wow, I just spent $250 and I completely forgot about that. Or wow, I was using, let's say you're using some type of database on Amazon RDS and you've used way over top of your quota, you're getting charged for that. So as a customer, if you don't realize you're using that many API calls, you might be a little surprised. And complex to implement. To do meter-based solution, you need a lot of technology in there to be able to manage that. So the next part here is looking at how will we monetize APIs. A lot of us think of per API call, but there's a lot of companies that do it much more complex than that. So for instance, Cinch or Twilio is going to do it based on transaction volume. Stripe might do it based on revenue or cost share, so they're going to charge on a percentage. Datadog is data volume. Segment is going to charge based on users. And then lastly, something like Redshift is going to charge on resources that have been used. The easiest one, transaction volume. The rest of them are quite a bit more complex to implement. So once you've decided on how you're going to monetize, then you come to this of, okay, if I'm doing subscription-based or I'm charging for a quota, if they use more, what am I going to do? The first way to do it would be, and this is what we always hear, is like, hey, our finance team asked, should we charge overages or should we not? You have kind of 3 ways to tackle this. And that would be, the first one is, as soon as they reach their quota, shut off their access. That's going to be pretty inconvenient because what you're doing is you're penalizing users for using up to their quota. The next way to do this is to obviously charge a subscription overage. And just the way that overages come across, you're getting penalized for going above your tier. So what generally happens is you might pay, let's say, 1 cent per API call for your allocated subscription. That's what it turns out to. But as soon as you go over, now you're paying 3 or 4 cents per API call because you went over your allocated quota. Well, that means that it's going to be hard to expand that because no one wants to go over and use more usage than what they've paid for. So the way that we've actually found and the way that we recommend to customers to do this is make those API tiers adjustable. So if someone is subscribed to 10,000 calls, when they come close to it, interact with them somehow, whether it's through email or whether it's through customer success, and say, hey, you're getting close to your cap. Why don't you think about upgrading to the 15,000 API call? Then you won't have to worry about overage fees, and most of the time when you subscribe to more, your overall cost per call is going to go down. So that's one thing to think about as you talk about overages. And then another thing that you want to think about is, and again, all of these questions are going to help you to dictate what technology you should be using. So when you talk to users, when you look at how users will pay for their API usage, you're going to have 2 main camps. They're either going to pay ahead, so prepaid billing, or they're going to pay after, postpaid billing. Prepaid, I will tell you right now, is very hard to implement. It's extremely complex because there's a lot of moving parts. Postpaid, much easier. Now, with prepaid, what happens is users are going to purchase credits ahead of time, which most of us are familiar with this business model. If everyone can remember pay-as-you-go phones, you buy ahead, you burn through the quota. When you're done, you're done. With postpaid, as the month goes on, we're going to tally up usage, and at the end, we're going to say, here's your bill. The pros of prepaid, better cash flow, because if someone's prepaying, you have that cash in hand before they're actually using the service. It's also tends to be more familiar with traditional enterprise. They don't mind paying ahead of time because they've already calculated what they're going to use. The cons of this, friction in onboarding. If someone hasn't used your API before and you're saying you have to pay for this service before you use it, how do they know that it's actually going to benefit them? There's ways around this. You can offer a free trial, free credits, that kind of stuff, but it's not always something that you will do. And as I kind of mentioned, pay-as-you-go, very difficult to implement. And we'll go into that as we go into the tech stack. For pros of postpaid billing, less onboarding friction. We all love it when we sign up for something and they say, we'll send you a bill at the end of the month. It means that we don't have to pay right now, we can start using it, and then we'll tackle that bill after. It's also a lot easier to implement than prepaid, because with prepaid, we need to find a way to burn down those credits per usage, and that's a lot of different technologies to do that. With postpaid, add up the usage, send it to the billing provider once a month, and charge them for it. Much easier. I'd say the 2 real cons of this are additional credit risk. So let's just say you're using some third-party API through your API. You're getting charged $1 per call because it's a very expensive API. This user's postpaid. They've used 1,000 calls. So now you're already $1,000 into that third-party API, and all of a sudden, that customer says, I got the bill, but I'm not paying. Then you're going to have an issue because now you've taken on that credit risk. Even if you don't have some expensive third-party API, you're always going to have a cost associated with your APIs. We're talking about some APIs are going to get millions or even billions of calls per month. As that balance continues to accrue, there's a chance that you might not be able to recoup it. Because of this, you also have this, where it can be abused. Pay as you go, if you're paying for 10,000 API calls, you can only use 10,000 API calls, so it's really hard to abuse that above that quota. With postpaid, that could definitely happen. Now, the next part here talks about, when will they pay for that API usage Is it going to be recurring or threshold based? Is a customer going to be invoiced on a schedule, or are they going to be invoiced after they've hit a specific credit threshold? People are probably familiar with threshold based, especially in AWS, where you can say, I want to get a bill every single month, but if I do go above my $250 spend limit, invoice me then, because I want to make sure that I'm able to pay that bill. Recurring, easier for finance teams on both sides. We know that our business knows that we have this revenue coming in at the end of every single month. And the buyer's side, they also know that they have to settle that bill at the end of the month. It's more predictable because they know when the bill's coming. Con is users can rack up very big bills, and that credit risk can come into factor here. With threshold-based, it helps keep the customer's budget in check, but it also means that what you get is you might have bills where, okay, they used it for a week and they pay a $250 bill. Then they use it for 3 weeks and then they pay the $250 bill. Then they use it for 1 week and then 6 weeks. So you have this really unpredictable revenue stream. And that's not always great to have either, especially if you're a younger startup and you want to show predictable revenue. This can actually impact that. The nice part about that, as a kind of a pro of that unpredictability, is it at least reduces your liability in terms of keeping bills within that customer threshold. So if a user says, I can only spend $250 at a time, you know that you're not going to have them come back to you and say, I can't afford my bill. So taking all of that stuff into account, I know it was probably a little bit dry. Hopefully you took a couple pictures of it. If you're watching at home, those things are what you want to kind of talk to your business team about. Determining those requirements, and some of them they will not have thought about. They'll go, I just wanted to monetize APIs. I don't really care how we do it. You need to ask those questions because they will come up eventually. Once you have those in hand, then you can start thinking about building your monetization stack. And what the monetization stack is essentially, when we think about an API stack, we have these different technologies we put together. This is just essentially doing that, looking at what technologies you need to kind of string together in order to make that API monetization a possibility. Now, as I told you, API monetization is hard. But why it's hard, you can probably start to see that there's a lot of questions that you need to have almost 100% congruence with your business on. This here is what your business is going to have the hardest time with: developing a pricing strategy. Because we talked about all that stuff to do with, when are you going to do billing, how are they going to pay? But what we didn't even talk about is how much are you going to charge per API call or per API usage? Then you also have the factor of trying to manage the API access. So how are you going to manage that access? Are you going to do it through API management, some type of proxy? You have to determine these types of things. And then lastly, you need to track usage accurately. So if you don't track it accurately, you're not going to bill accurately, and you're not going to create revenue accurately either. These things are what make it hard. Obviously, there's subsets of this, but these are the core things that make it tough to do. Now, there's 5 pieces of an API monetization stack. Firstly, the actual APIs themselves. Most of us already own these. Then we have the sign-up and enrollment process, which this tends to be the crux of the problem. And we'll spend some time on those slides. Then you have the mechanism for controlling access. So usually this is API management. There's obviously other ways to do this, but API management is kind of the go-to way to do it. Fourth, you need a system of record for tallying usage. Then lastly, you need a billing provider. Who's actually going to invoice these users? The first one we're going to look at is the APIs themselves. So obviously everyone here is familiar with the APIs that they have, but when it comes to actually monetizing those APIs, what 2 things should they do at a minimum? Firstly, that API should contain value that users will pay for. Don't monetize an API that no one wants. You're just going to waste your time and effort. Look at stuff where either you have competitors that are offering that API, and maybe you can put a competitive product out there. Or what you might do is based on interactions that you see within your platform. So maybe you have a front-end application that calls APIs in the back end. If there's something there, maybe one that I like to use is maybe you have a credit report API where you have an API that goes out, retrieves a credit report, and brings it back to your platform. Lots of other platforms likely need credit reporting like that. That might be a good API to monetize. So you need to make sure it has value. Someone's willing to pay for it. And it needs to deliver that value quickly. A lot of the time, this means single API calls to be able to deliver value, not multiple chains of calls to be able to do stuff like, let's say if we have a fintech API and we have to do one call to retrieve the user, then to retrieve the account, then to retrieve the balance. That's 3 calls. It's not going to deliver value quickly, and there's probably a lot of kind of background stuff that goes on. Let's make it a single call. Even if we have to do a wrapper API, let's make it a single call and then monetize that so that it delivers value quickly. So from a developer's perspective, what they want to see in a monetized API, easy integration, and this comes down, easy integration is not just about how you build your API, it's also how you document it. So you want to make sure that you show people how to do it through tutorials, docs, demos, these types of things. The payment structure should also be easy to understand. And kind of when we think about how we monetize products in general, I love when you go to a site, you go to the pricing page, and you can slide a slider and see exactly how much it's going to cost you for that amount of API calls. Or a really easy to look at, tiered breakdown or table. You want to make it easy to understand how much it's going to cost. And deliver value. Make sure that the API that you're charging for is actually delivering what they expect. You might onboard a ton of people. You have 1 million people come to use your API, you've monetized it, and then all of them leave. Well, why did they leave? Because it wasn't valuable to them. So if you want to retain customers, you also need to deliver value. The next part we'll look at is this sign up and enrollment process. This is where if I am sitting on, let's say, 10 meetings per week with companies looking to implement API monetization, this is where they get stuck. They get stuck on the fact that they don't really understand what sign up or enrollment means for APIs. They might have other products out there. They might even have a B2C product, and they have a great registration flow, and they don't realize that they need something similar for people signing up to use their APIs. So when we talk about how users sign up to use those APIs, what they need is they need something that's straightforward and accessible. You shouldn't have to go to your customer success team and talk to 10 different people to get API access. They should be able to go to your website, I want to access that API, and then be able to access it. When you're registering folks, you want to ask for enough information, but not too much. So many of us go to websites, we might go to sign up for something, and there's like 40 fields, a bunch of drop downs, and it's like, you know what, I'll just go to a competitor because I don't feel like filling out 40 fields. The competitor has 2. The minimum that you want is probably email and maybe address, billing address. So you want to make sure that you're not kind of overdoing it in terms of how much information you're collecting. You also want to make sure that you collect a payment method at this point. Don't let them access the platform, get into your, let's say, developer portal, and then when they go to access the API, it says, hey, you got to add a billing method. And then they got to figure it out in settings and all these types of steps to get it set up. Just ask for it then. As they're treat it like a checkout. As they're checking out to get access, collect the payment then. And this last piece has a question mark because should you offer a free trial? If you have a very expensive API, maybe it doesn't make sense to offer a free trial. If you have an API that is very targeted, like let's say the credit reporting API that I mentioned, maybe you don't offer a free trial on that because you know folks that are coming to you are going to be B2B businesses. They already know what they want. They want to retrieve a credit score. Let's just go that route. So you might want a free trial. You might not. It just depends what service you're offering through your APIs. Now, as you implement that enrollment flow, if you actually want to be successful with API monetization, you need to look at how you're converting. It's not enough to just put out your API and go, let's see who uses it. what you should be looking at is this part is likely going to be some type of front-end application, and this back part is going to be, on the back end itself. You want to look at how many people come to the site, and then that sign up for it. But that's not enough either. You also need to know how long is it taking them to sign up. And you can see from this chart here, to go from their first page visit to signing up, it's taking 13 hours, and only 20% of folks are converting. We might look at this and say, why is that happening? We've built this great API, and people should be using it. Why are they not using it? Well, maybe it's because, and this actually happened with a couple customers that we had, their sign-up form was broken 50% of the time. That's going to be a major impact, right? So they didn't know that until they actually wrap metrics around it. But if you find that, wow, we got a ton of site traffic and no one's converting, you should be asking questions about that. It's either the wrong people or your sign-up flow is broken, whether technically broken or how people are checking out, they're just not enjoying that. The next piece might be, how many people sign up and don't make a first API call? If your sign-up is very specifically aimed at people using your API and it's not convoluted, this should technically be 100%. Because you don't want someone signing up for your service and not using it. Now, if you start to see stuff like, my favorite is when you ask people, hey, how long does it take to integrate with your API? Super easy to integrate. You'll have things going in 5 minutes. And then you see this. Oh, actually, it took 6 hours. That's a problem too. So we need to make sure that we have metrics in place to look at this. And then, most importantly, might be when we make the money. We don't make money off of one API call. We make money off of repeated API calls. So how many people are going from their first API call and moving to a recurring API call? If they're not moving from first API call to recurring API calls, we need to ask, why is that happening? Let me just check time here. I want to make sure awesome. So what you want to do optimally, especially if you're having, let's say, I won't say small time customers, but not large enterprises spending, hundreds of thousands with you a month on your APIs, you probably want to opt for self-service sign-up. The reason why, if anybody here works for a B2B company, which probably most of you do, legal and security can absolutely tie up deals. Having click-through terms of service in a self-service portal makes it much easier to get through. Most of us just click the agree button and then move to the next. We don't need to worry about, legal and compliance stuff slowing it down. What we see a lot of times with adoption is product priorities are stopping stuff from being adopted. So if I have an API, I want people to adopt it. They go to their team and say, hey, this really, really cool API exists. I think we should adopt this API. Well, what happens is, sure, put it on the roadmap. It's going to take 2 months for us to use that service. If you're able to make the integration fast, you can prove value quickly, and you can also maybe jump the line over top of those product priorities. You also want to opt for that payment via credit card, as I mentioned earlier. And that's because finance and procurement will do two things. They'll delay your deal, and anyone who's dealt with procurement knows they're going to try and ding you down on the price that you're bringing in. Charge via credit card, there's probably not much negotiation going on. You also want to make sure to give pay options during enrollment. You might have all of these. You might have a subset of them. So do you offer prepaid and or postpaid billing? So you might offer that. How do you want to pay each month? You might also say to them, how do you want to subscribe? So as we mentioned, there is a way to get kind of the best of both worlds. When we look at, remember how I mentioned subscription-based is great because you get a minimum spend, but metered is better because it looks cheaper and it also means that folks can expand more easily. You can offer both of that. So maybe someone knows, hey, we are absolutely going to use exactly 10,000 API calls per month, and that perfectly fits this subscription tier. And maybe they're paying 2 cents per API call. So they go, great, I know exactly what my cost is. But then you might also offer metered and say, hey, if you don't fit into this subscription-based, you can use metered too. It's just going to cost you a little bit more to do that. So there is a way to kind of have the best of both worlds there. You might also want to offer volume discounts, and you can offer that on both subscription and metered. What you might say is, as you use more, it gets cheaper. What that does is that helps with expansion. And then you also probably want to give them the option for invoice interval, where you might say, how often do you want to be charged? Daily, monthly, weekly, whatever they have. Quarterly is a very popular one that we've seen in the last bit, so having that invoice interval would be good as well. So once you've got the APIs there, you've got the enrollment there, then you need to look at a mechanism for controlling access. If you have a monetized API, you don't want people who aren't paying for it to be able to access it. Usually for that, you're going to use API management. And most of us in this room are likely using some type of APIM solution already. What does it offer in terms of benefit to monetization? Well, it's going to give you the ability to secure APIs. Most platforms give you the ability to productize APIs. It's also going to allow you to collect API metrics. And so overall, what does it add? And I really want to chat about this part. And I know there's more than one API management person in this room. I won't stare at anybody. But this is kind of a pain point for a lot of folks. API management adds security and authorization. And that is kind of a core APIM thing. All of us who are using API management are likely using it for that. You also get this ability to do user management through, you can check who's going into the platform, but you can also do stuff like through key provisioning and marrying those two concepts of security and user management together. You also, depending on the platform, may be allowed to run some data governance stuff, only allowing certain folks to access certain data. And then you also get a developer portal with it. Now, I don't know who in here has tried to monetize APIs and then use a developer portal that's built into a gateway to actually do their self-serve checkout flow, but out of the box, it is almost impossible. And what I see from a lot of gateway companies is that they really, really want the developer portal to be used for that. But a lot of legacy APIM models, developer portals were meant for internal APIs. That developer portal was be able to access internally. You could provision API keys. You didn't really care because it was only internal people using them. You probably weren't charging for them. In the modern age of taking your API infrastructure and exposing that externally, most of these developer portals kind of break down. Now, can they be fixed in order to accommodate monetization? Absolutely. The question is, how much time do you want to spend on it, and how flexible is that solution? Not a plug on my own work at all, but what we did, because we actually integrate with most major gateways, we went on a mission to expand those gateways for monetization. We found that what happened is you end up with a very, very brittle implementation. So we actually wrote an open source developer portal that in a basic sense solves this issue, but it gives a springboard. Why did we do that? Because even though API management offers a developer portal, most people that monetize tend to build a custom portal. Why is that important? For anyone who's built one of those portals, they probably find that of all the pieces of monetization to get it working, that takes the longest to do. It's actually very tough to build a developer portal because you're essentially building a whole entire platform. The great part about using it within an API management tool is that it's managed usually within that platform, but if it doesn't support monetization or you need to heavily customize it, you're probably better off building it versus buying it. Second last thing that I want to cover here is the system of record for tallying usage. So as you give people access and you manage their access, you also need to start recording how much they're using. That's where you're going to have that system of record for tallying usage. And what you're going to get from that is you need to have two things that should do at a minimum. It should create accurate usage records. If they're not accurate, it's actually detrimental to both sides. If the usage record isn't accurate, you're either likely overcharging your users or you're underreporting your revenue. What you also need to keep in mind is that providing timely reporting to the billing provider. This is especially crucial if you're doing pay-as-you-go, because every time that something's being used, that should be reported directly and burned down against the credits that they have. If you're invoicing monthly, it probably doesn't matter as much, but it's still nice to have it there, because what you generally will see is a lot of users in the billing provider, they're going to want to see how much money they've spent for the month. If you only report that once a month, they're not going to be able to track that, and they might be mad at the end of the month when they see their bill. So on top of those things, the best solutions for a book of record for this also allow you to do various metrics that you can bill upon. So go beyond just doing API call metrics. And then what we talked about in the previous slide, where we talked about resource usage, user-centric billing, these types of things. If you only support per API call, you're not going to be able to do that stuff. Again, which is why I said you should ask how your business wants to implement API monetization, because if they do need to be able to do those very technical types of billing, it's going to really slim down the options that you have to implement with. Also, it would be nice for business users to access the platform. Wouldn't it be nice if, as engineers, all we had to do was set up the infrastructure for API monetization, and then a business user can go in, and based on how they want to set up the billing, they can go in and adjust what should be monetized. Because the last thing we need as developers is another thing that we need to manage. The last part here is allowing for easy auditing. And this is very crucial, because if there's some type of billing discrepancy, you need to go to the system of record where that was tallied up. If you can't audit how they came to that total, it's going to be very, very hard to explain to a customer, yeah, we don't know what happened. Your bill is your bill. If you're able to audit, you can go in and say, well, you got charged for 400,000 API calls, and yeah, our system actually says that you only did 395,000 calls. So between the system of record and the billing provider, 5,000 API calls were added, and then you can troubleshoot at the billing provider layer. So easy auditing is something that you should definitely look for. Once you've got that in place, tallying up that usage, you're going to pass that usage to a billing provider. And that is the last piece in the puzzle. For that, what you're going to get is you need to make sure that you ask these questions, because this is going to narrow down which billing provider you use. So for instance, maybe you have an in-house billing provider, and it only is going to support post-paid billing, and your company comes to you and says, hey, we really need to do prepaid. Well, you can then explain to them, the billing provider that we've chosen currently does not support that. Therefore, we need to think about implementing a new billing provider. As part of this, you need to think about these things. Existing integrations with other platforms. What we see a lot of times is people want billing data to be passed over to something like Salesforce, or they're running jobs in Snowflake or Databricks. There's always ways to get data from one point to another, but if the billing provider already has an integration with those platforms, usually it's a couple clicks and you're integrated. You don't have to worry about building some type of sub-process to bring data over, or some type of ETL pipeline to move it. What you also get is you need to think about what type of pricing schemes do they support. So if your business says, we really, really want to be able to offer people free trials, or we want to be able to offer them discount coupons for our APIs or discount codes, but your billing provider doesn't support that, well, you have one option, which is find a billing provider that does. But you won't know that until you ask. So asking this question up front as you're determining this is going to save a lot of heartache. Because if you implement the whole entire flow end to end, and then next thing you know, this is the crux that you're stuck in, you may find that your billing provider touches a bunch of different spots, and ripping that out is going to, expand the project scope. This one is probably my favorite as a developer. Is it easy to work with? I don't want to work with a platform that I have to, play around with forever to get it to work, or maybe it just doesn't work the way I want it to? Is it easy to work with? I've worked with Stripe a lot. I love Stripe. Very, very easy to implement. So you kind of want to look for what suits your needs as a developer. Lastly, support for billing issues and auditing. If we come to something like I just mentioned where a customer got charged for X but actually used Y, and you know that it happened on the billing provider side, is there someone that you can reach out to for billing issues? And is there a way to audit? So if you need to figure out how those extra 5,000 usage points got added to that, and no one's there to help you, it's going to be very, very hard to keep your customers happy. And it's not necessarily if you'll have billing issues, you will at some point. So you want to make sure that you have a billing provider that the customer support's there, right? So examples of billing providers that we've seen customers use are Stripe, Recurly, ChargeBee, and we've also seen folks do stuff within Salesforce. There's some proprietary Salesforce providers. SAP is another platform we've seen folks use. So figure out kind of what's existing in the stack. If someone says to you in your business, we absolutely have to use SAP, figure out what the limitations are, and then make sure that you manage that as a development team. So what does this actually look like in action? I'm going to show you kind of a high-level diagram. It's probably it probably matches what you already have in your head, but many people that come to us don't necessarily know what API monetization looks like in action. So of all those points, what we get is, and I'll use my fancy pointer here. So in the corner here, we're going to have our APIs. Maybe we have our API management solution, all of that. As the API usage gets metered, it needs to come into this system of record where we're metering that usage. Whether you're doing prepaid, postpaid, subscription-based, meter-based, you still need that usage to come into a central book of record. Then what you need is, whether it's built into the platform where you do this, or you have some type of job that runs, you need to aggregate the usage and send it to your billing provider of choice. Depending on what you're using, this might have more or less flexibility. If you're and it also, the technicality of it might go exponentially higher. So if, let's just say I'm keeping track of everything in a system like Snowflake, then I might need a data scientist to actually help me to create that aggregated usage. So you have to keep into account, who do I actually have on staff to do this? If I need a data scientist and I don't have one on staff right now, then I might need to look at a different solution. Optimally, from the billing provider, most of them provide a webhook. And that webhook can supply all of these platforms. So API management, the metered billing solution, it can supply it with subscription data. This is extremely important when you're talking about doing pay-as-you-go. Because as aggregated usage moves over into the billing provider, let's just say they're using 1 transaction per second, we need to also at the same time pass the real-time balance back through to this part here to say if they have enough credits to actually execute that API call, or if we should block that API call. As you go into pay-as-you-go, it gets exponentially more difficult to implement. However, it is possible to do it, and there's tons of ways that you can actually implement this depending on the tech stack you're using. If you do come across this stuff and want to chat about it, you'll see my email at the end. I love dealing with this stuff. Now, just monetizing the APIs generally is not enough for us to do. We usually have to treat this more from a developer experience perspective, because the users of our APIs are developers. Developers are not picky people. However, they do expect kind of a minimum of communication and certain things that come with a platform. The first one, probably the easiest one to implement, is keep users in the loop via email. Now, as developers, we get a ton of emails, but one thing that I have that I always look at is anytime I have a usage email, I'm looking at it. So do stuff like send a weekly usage report. Show maybe a nicely formatted HTML. Show them how much they've burned through of their allocation. Or show them how they're trending towards their quota. Show them how much they've used in their postpaid, what you can do is you need to communicate with them as best as you can how much they've used. What you can also do is, if it's subscription based, this is also a great time to get them to bump up to the next tier. If they've been allocated 10,000 API calls, and need to move to the next tier, you can let them know at that point, hey, you should bump up to 15,000 API calls at this point. Now, the next thing that we'll look at, probably want to have a developer portal or customer portal and show them how they're using their consumption. Sorry, my throat's getting a little dry here. So you want to show users their consumption. And this is important because this allows you to move away from those billing surprises. The tougher one here is block users when they shouldn't have access. There's two reasons likely why they shouldn't have access. Either they have went over their allocation or they've canceled their plan. And what I usually ask any of our prospects coming to us that are implementing API monetization is, if someone cancels a plan in Stripe, how do you plan to block that API access? Do you plan to block it at the key level? Are you going to go through and deprovision all of their keys? What if they've bought an allocated usage for the month, 10,000 API calls, and you still need to give them access, even though they canceled? You need to give them access to that up to that API call amount. Every single one of these questions and how you implement the billing has to be thought about, and it's actually very, very difficult to solve. And kind of as I mentioned, it's because there's so many ways that you could solve this. It's always custom, and it depends on what API management solution you're using, what billing provider are you using, how are you keeping track of usage, are you taking subscription data and moving that into some type of central user repository where you can control access from. You have to keep all of this in mind. We have solved this within Moesif, but there's lots of ways that you could solve this on top of that as well. Some are more and less complex. So with that, hopefully that gives you some ideas around what you should be asking your business and also how you could implement monetization, because I think we're going to see a massive wave of API monetization coming through our industry within especially the next 2 to 3 years. Thank you very much for joining, and we'll move over to Q&A if that's good.